Hello and welcome to the Champagne Anarchism read-through of the first chapter of Arundhati Roy's Capitalism, A Ghost Story. That's this book here. We are getting into it today. We are talking the IMF, we are talking the arts, we are talking Tata Steel, we are talking the Ambani family and human rights and philanthropy and all of this together. We are going to discuss it all. I am really excited to get into it. If you want all of these episodes, if you want to read along chapter by chapter with this book and with this series, you can go to Patreon. That's patreon.com/champagneanarchism and sign up to that channel over there. It will give you a feed with all of these together, as well as much more cool stuff. And you can also go back on that Patreon feed and read along with Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, which is the first book that we did. This is the second book in the series, in the Champagne Anarchism reading series. So if you have always wanted to read The Wretched of the Earth or Capitalism, A Ghost Story, this is the perfect place to start. Head over there. All those main feed things are absolutely free. I will not charge you a cent for those. I just think that that should be information that's out there, and more people should read and kind of appreciate these books. So thank you very much to everybody who's already signed up over there. It's really cool to see people following along with this stuff. And thank you to everybody as well who's following me on social media, and really thank you for all your comments and your questions. It's really cool to engage with people who care so passionately about this stuff. I also care very, very passionately about this. Otherwise, I would not be doing this. Now, how are we going to break down this first chapter? I'm also going through the preface here very briefly. This is a preface of just a couple pages, but it's not a skippable preface. This is a must-read preface. We're going to break this section down into a couple different things, because the way I hope you walk away from this chapter is with a new understanding of certain things. And those things are going to be terrorism, art, philanthropy, and human rights. And if you've read the chapter, you know that they're all related together. So we are roughly going to be breaking down this chapter with a bit of a read through of the first preface and the first bit of this chapter, and then we're going to go into those four sections and kind of see how Arundhati Roy looks at these things and how she kind of turns our normal understanding of these things on its head. And when you go away from this lecture, I hope you have a new appreciation for, okay, maybe that corporate philanthropy thing that I saw last week, that little pamphlet from ExxonMobil or whatever, maybe that wasn't what I thought it was. That's what I'm really hoping for you here. And the thing, as always, with Arundhati Roy and her work, which I've said several times on socials and in the introductory video. You can also, by the way, check out that introductory video that's on the feed already. But the thing that I keep saying about Arundhati Roy is that she's a novelist, and she's a very, very good novelist. And that translates perfectly into her political writing. We will see quotes and lines, and I'll be quoting quite extensively from this chapter, where the literal writing is soaring and phenomenal. It's searing as well. It burns into your memory, certain lines from this thing. So I hope you take the time to sit down with this book. It's a very short book, but boy, is it dense. I mean, this is significantly shorter than The Wretched of the Earth, and definitely Manufacturing Consent, which is the next book that we're doing. But in terms of the things that Roy is packing into there, in terms of just the ideas that we're taking a look at, it's incredibly dense. And for the sake of time, because it would take hours and hours and hours to really explicate all of these different things that she's raising in this chapter, I will be skimming over certain things. But if there is something that you would like to know more about, if there's something that you think, oh, let's talk more about the Ford Foundation. Like, what is the history of the Ford Foundation? What is the significance of the CFR? What's happening here? That is something I would love to address. So please let me know in the comments. Now, let's get into this chapter. We start with the preface. This is a story of displacement. The preface is all about clearing people, this drive to beautify New Delhi before the Commonwealth Games. And she talks about this clearing of the shanty towns and the communities around Delhi that have oftentimes been forced displaced from their home territory and have had to move into the city but can't come directly into the city, and so move to these kind of outskirts around these important parts of the city. And now that the Commonwealth Games are coming to India, They must be cleared. This is what the officials are saying in this preface. And so Roy, and this is a theme that comes through the first chapter as well, this theme of displacement and people having to move in the name of progress, some vague notion of progress. This displacement is put in incredibly poetic terms in the preface. And it may call to mind something that we talked about with Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, this idea of the lumpen proletariat. Remember that Frantz Fanon talks about the lumpen proletariat as this kind of underclass that sits on the edges of the city. They are not of the countryside where there are their own centers of power and where they have sort of a different way of life. And they are not of the city because they can't quite access that capital that's coming into the city. So they exist in this liminal space on the outskirts of the city. And Fanon tells us that these are people that you need to sway to your side, that you need on your side if you want a revolution, or at least a revolution with some staying power. Because otherwise the colonizer will come in and take over, just sweep them from the space or pull them onto their side. And what Roy here is describing is this process, this incredibly violent process of removing people from these shanty towns so that we can put on some games and put up a billboard that says deliciously yours, whatever nonsense they're putting out there. It's an incredible preface, and it's tremendously evocative. And she speaks of two girls who fight each other over a bit of money that's handed to them by a driver as they're begging outside. And she uses this as a really effective metaphor as a really effective image, kind of symbolism for what's happening in the city. Again, if you're reading Capitalism, a Ghost Story, do not skip the preface. Now, chapter 1, the first part of chapter 1 is maybe one of my favorite parts in the book. There are two standout moments in this book that really have stuck with me so much. You will see when we talk about the later chapters, I think that will be the third lecture on this book, the second part. But the first part is where we get the name Capitalism, a Ghost Story. Arundhati Roy starts with Antilla, which is the giant mansion complex built by Mukesh Ambani. He's the head of Reliance Industries. He's one of these scions, ultra billionaires, one of the richest people in the world, and he has just built this complex and he's called it Antilla. And if the name Ambani rings a bell, especially at time of recording, this is 2024, that's probably for a reason. Mukesh Ambani's son, that's Anant Ambani, got married earlier this year in a wedding that was one of the most lavish in history, as far as I'm aware. It's cost him about or not him, certainly, but it cost about $600 million to put this wedding on. Bill Gates attended, Mark Zuckerberg attended, Rihanna performed at this wedding. This is a huge and fabulous and opulent occasion, and I was looking for a number that would sort of put $600 million in context, and then I realized that there's just no good way to put that in context. This is an absurd number to spend on a wedding, on a single event, especially considering the amount of poverty that is in the world. This is a ridiculous thing. Now, Roy is writing back in 2015. She doesn't have this example to hand, but she does have Antilla. And these lights that are illuminating this complex are stark and bright. And she's outside of this. And she returns to this scene at the end of the chapter in a really brilliant way that we'll come back to. But she's looking at this scene, and she's making this out to be a perfect symbol for the inequality and privatization and IMF programs and drive towards late-stage capitalism that India experienced. And if you want more detail on that, by the way, on the experience of India in the 80s, 90s, and their IMF program, you can check out the introductory video that's on this channel. I won't go too much into that, but suffice to say, this is typical Washington consensus neoliberal story where the IMF comes in and demands certain things, and because of those things, we have spiraling inequality and absolute devastation in the wake of these programs. And one of the things that Roy talks about, not in this book, but in a very famous essay called The Death of Imagination, is this idea that she continually refers to that I just love, which is sort of, if you had to put it succinctly, it's this idea that we have lost something of the imagination that we used to have, that our demands for our humanity have somehow shrunk. The Death of Imagination, the essay, is about the nuclear program that India engaged with, sort of an arms arms race between India and Pakistan. And I highly recommend going and finding that essay and reading it. It is a tremendous essay. I can't recommend it highly enough. But when I was reading this section, I kept thinking of that term, that phrase, the death of imagination. Because as she's describing this privatization and this push and the Ambani residents and all of this, she talks about the land reform demands by the Naxalites and Sampurna Kranti, which we'll come to in just a moment, but the demands for huge programs and restructuring and just a different way to live. And now, she says, those would be unthinkable. Now remember, and I don't want to completely always continually refer back to Fanon, but remember when Fanon told us that the real victory for the colonizer comes when the colonized have internalized the dreams and the wishes and the desires of the colonizer, when they have internalized the values of the colonizer. And this is exactly what Arundhati Roy is talking about here. This, for Roy, is the death of imagination. But what about that line? That line, capitalism, a ghost story? Well, it's because she's talking about Karl Marx. She actually quotes him here right at the beginning because she says that the Ambanis, it's rumored, that the Ambanis don't actually live there because maybe it's just ghosts and bad luck. And she recalls this Karl Marx quote. And I'm going to read the quote from Karl Marx. Capitalism, he said, quote, has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange that it is like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld, whom he has called up by his spells, end quote. It's a fabulous quote. If you've read Marx, you know that's from the Communist Manifesto, and that's why it's a lot more evocative than something that you might find in Capital. But it's a fabulous quote, and it's got tremendous imagery, right? This sorcerer who has conjured up the spirits of the netherworld and can't control them anymore. Capitalism, it now, or as Marx would say, the capitalist mode of production, not quite capitalism yet, but the capitalist mode of production, it runs on its own steam. It just keeps going and churning, and it almost doesn't even require humans to be a part of it anymore. It just is a system. And so that's where we get the imagery of the ghosts of the netherworld, these spirits that this sorcerer has conjured. And then Arundhati Roy comes in with its next line, and this is a quote from Roy, again on page 8. She says, in India, the 300 million of us who belong to the new post-international monetary fund IMF reforms, middle class, the market, live side by side with spirits of the netherworld, the poltergeists of dead rivers, dry wells, bald mountains, and denuded forests, the ghosts of 250,000 debt-ridden farmers who have killed themselves, and of the 800 million who have been impoverished and dispossessed to make way for us. And right at the beginning, I think this is literally the second page. Yes, this is literally the second page in this chapter. You can see the power of Arundhati Roy and her words, her writing here. This is why I love this book so much. This is why I keep coming back to it, because you can list facts and figures, but if you don't have that spark, that talent, that thing that Roy just has that allows her to communicate these things in such a beautiful way, it just doesn't land quite right. The good thing with Roy is that she does have the facts and figures, and she has all of the things behind her that she can marshal at her fingertips, but she puts them in such a brilliant way that it's almost undeniable. And so this is where we get the ghost story, because we are living in among the ghosts of the netherworld that the sorcerer of capitalism has conjured up about us. And maybe, just maybe, that's why Mukesh Ambani and his family don't spend any time in this horrific residence that they've built, because they are haunted too by these ghosts. Now, I should mention, by way of a little bit of background, she has in this bit where she talks about the demands and the people who would have fought back in the 70s, before this giant structural adjustment program that the IMF foisted on India. She talks about the Naxalites, and she talks about Sampurna Kranti. Now, Sampurna Kranti was a movement in the 1970s that eventually got fairly solidly snuffed out under Indira Gandhi. It was led by this socialist activist and politician, Jayaprakash Narayan, and please forgive my pronunciation for all of these things. But Sampurna Kranti, or the Bihar movement as well, you may have seen it referred to as the Bihar movement, that no longer really exists, although what it started certainly still does. The Naxalites, however, do absolutely exist. They began in West Bengal. They're still very much there. And the Naxalites, though they are much diminished after repeated military actions by the Indian government, they're a Maoist insurgency. Maoism, in this sense, is not quite the stuff of the Cultural Revolution. It is more focused around land reform and things like that. Mao, in a lot of his work, he puts a lot of emphasis on this idea of land reform. There is so much more detail to that, by the way, that I'm just skimming over, so apologies if you are a political science person. But the Maoist insurgents are the people who have come to Arundhati Roy on the strength of her first novel, The God of Small Things, which again is a work of genius and everybody should read. But The God of Small Things comes out, the Maoists approach her, and she is one of the people who takes them the most seriously. Now, this is something that we'll come to in a second when we talk about terrorism. But first, we have one more thing to talk about with this idea of displacement. Now, remember, we began in the preface with displacement, but she tells the story of Tata Steel. Now, Tata Steel is a division of the Tata company. This is one of the biggest conglomerates, certainly in India and definitely in the world. It's one of those companies that's a bit like Samsung. If you've ever looked at Samsung and gone, okay, Samsung, cool, they make phones. Okay, they make washing machines as well. Oh, they make ships and helicopters, and they build hospitals. They have a health insurance offshoot. They have theme parks. They do everything. Tata is a bit like that. They have tendrils throughout India, and actually they have tendrils throughout India and throughout the world, in fact. Chances are you may have seen one of their cars, for example, at one point or another, even if you don't live in India. Now, Tata Steel in Chhattisgarh signed an agreement, a memorandum of understanding to open a giant steel plant in this area of India, and was met, understandably, with significant resistance. That led to multiple confrontations, and one big confrontation that Roy talks about, which ended in militia opening fire on innocent protesters. And this is where Roy gives us a little bit of a look into her thinking here on terrorism as the Indian government certainly understands it, and I would argue as we in the rest of the world understand it. But then one last thing before we leave Tata Steel, and then I promise we'll get into terrorism. We'll get a lot more into this when we talk about manufacturing consent and the media. But one of the things that Roy mentions in this first bit of this chapter is the control that corporations have over the media. And it's actually two ways here. So a lot of media organizations, especially in India, but this is very, very much a phenomenon around the world, they depend on corporate dollars for their advertising revenue. And so are they going to be the ones that call out Tata Steel for creating the conditions that led to civilian deaths? Probably not. And she also talks about billionaire ownership of major media corporations, which is a constant theme and something that has only gotten significantly worse in places like the United States, where I am from. And then beyond that, she mentions that a lot of media companies, the big media companies, also have corporate offshoots that need a business-friendly environment. So there's this constant interplay, and we'll get a little bit more. No, never mind. We'll get a lot more into this when we talk about Chomsky and Herman's propaganda model, which is what they advance in manufacturing consent. But I don't want to get too ahead of myself on that. Just freaking mark your calendars for manufacturing consent. It is one of the books that shaped my entire existence. So definitely put it down. Let's talk about terrorism now, and let's come back to the Naxalites. So the Maoist insurgency that happens in West Bengal and kind of spreads like wildfire across this section of India, it's met by a series of extremely brutal crackdowns by the Indian security forces. And if you are like me and old enough to remember Operation Green Hunt from 2009, this is a huge Indian military operation that tries to stamp out that insurgency. In early days, it's fairly successful, but the Maoists, they still continue. And they are branded as terrorists. And this is one of the things that Roy has a key insight into, because she argues, and I would say that she's absolutely right on this, that terrorism, as defined by the Indian government, just means trying to farm your own land and trying to exist in this space without having a major steel company come in, displace you, and build a giant steel plant. Of course, the Maoists use violent means. Nobody is denying that. Remember Fanon, again. It's no way. You can't escape Fanon. But remember, Fanon talks about violence as a method for liberation. But more than that, as a way to liberate the self. So violence is a way to liberate a country, but also people engaging in violence liberate themselves through that process of violence. And so this is one of the things that Arundhati Roy, because she is so sympathetic to this cause, she sort of turns it on its head. And as you read this book, you will see why she is such a polarizing figure, because she is willing to go out and defend people who have been branded terrorists by their government to such an extent that they've had massive military operations to try to stamp out the terrorists. And we can think about this in global terms as well. How many times have you seen the word terrorist thrown around by governments and by media and by people just talking about these things when we talk about Hamas or Hezbollah or the Taliban or the Houthis? I'm guessing the answer is often. Now, how many times then do we try to understand where the terrorists have come from, what the history is, what the context is for these terrorist movements? We are confronted by a situation where terrorism just sort of seems to appear out of nowhere, where people will very happily say, we have to go fight these terrorists because terrorists are terrorists and terrorists are bad. You have to fight terrorists. Everybody knows that. But what Roy is really interested in is, where do these movements come from? Why do they pop up? Why do they do the things they do? Fanon tells us that people are forced into violence because they have no other option, because they are colonized and dispossessed and dehumanized, and so it is the natural reaction to lash out. And Roy has enough pathos to go in and understand the insurgents from where they are sitting. And so when the Indian government tries to brand them as terrorists, and we should remember this, anytime you see the word terrorist thrown around, when the Indian government tries to brand them as terrorists, Roy pushes back. Terrorism is a useful catch-all term for a government that wants to stamp out something that is inconvenient to them. And she has this quote, yet another quote, again, talking about these rebels in West Bengal. This is on page 13. After 3 years of low-intensity conflict that has not managed to flush the rebels out of the forest, the central government has declared that it will deploy the Indian Army and Air Force. In India, we don't call this war, we call it creating a good investment climate. Now, this is a theme that we will return to over this book. This is people being forced out to make way for capital. This is the other side of Fanon. Fanon was writing in the 1960s, and Arundhati Roy is writing now, or at least very close to now in this book. She sees the other side of colonization. She sees the new forms of colonization, and you see this military deployment in terms of creating a good business climate that has nothing to do with the old school way that the French used to do it, which is literally, we believe this is French territory and so it should stay with us. In this case, this is, well, investors need this space. Well, a steel company needs this space. Why not send in military forces to make it a good investment climate? By the way, anytime you see one of those indexes, those stupid rankings that they continue doing, the ease of business climate surveys, notice how many violently authoritarian governments sit right at the top of that list. Because you know who can guarantee a good, stable investment climate is an authoritarian government every single time. Remember, I said these 4 things, terrorism, art, philanthropy, and human rights, these 4 things interplay with each other. We're not quite leaving terrorism, but we are going to talk about art for a moment. And we're talking about art because Arundhati Roy goes from this displacement and the mining corporations and the evil that they do, right into the Jaipur Literary Festival, which of course she's invited to, as are many literary luminaries and thinkers. Great writers and artists go to the Jaipur Literary Festival, and there's a lot of discussion of love and literature and politics and Sufi poetry, she says. And there are people who stand up and try to defend Salman Rushdie's ability to speak. And so they'll quote things from the Satanic Verses, which is, of course, the book that got him in a lot of hot water with many Islamic movements and countries around the world. And so they'll very bravely stand up and declare these things. And behind them, and she describes this scene so well, but behind them there's, of course, the logo of Tata Steel and its tagline, "Values stronger than steel." And the point that Roy is trying to make here is not that these are not great artists, that these are hypocrites by any means. In fact, she says on page 20, but which of us sinners was going to cast the first stone? Not me, who lives off royalties from corporate publishing houses. She recognizes that she's in this as well. In fact, we're all in this as well. But what Tata Steel is able to do by sponsoring this literary event is present itself as a benign and benevolent benefactor to these people who are bravely making a stand. And so Tata Steel can sort of associate itself with them. And so while it's helping these writers and thinkers and artists, they are helping it, Tata Steel, it being Tata Steel, way more than it is helping them. Because Tata Steel, and this is where that inversion comes in, Tata Steel is the real terrorist here. Tata Steel is the one displacing these people. Tata Steel is the one building this thing in the first place, the one that wants the investment climate created for it as it goes into these places. And so if it can come in and co-opt these thinkers and these movements and these people who are saying such brave things, and of course, yes, you're right, they are brave things, and you should defend Salman Rushdie's ability to write things like the Satanic Verses. But it comes out, but they come out, and behind them is that value stronger than steel, and the irony there is very difficult to get out of your head. In this section, Arundhati Roy also mentions things like the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act and Chhattisgarh's Special Public Security Act. These are things that are often used to suppress dissent. They can be very blanket and widely applied. And of course, Arundhati Roy and the people around her, the people who also write but maybe don't have Roy's stature and thus a little bit of immunity and protection, have often found themselves on the wrong side of these Indian rules that are meant to crack down on dissent. And of course, I'm saying Indian rules, this is not just an Indian thing. In fact, not so long ago in the United States, we had the Espionage Act that was used as a cudgel in a nation that supposedly enshrines the right to free speech. It's the same thing. Now let's take that idea that we've just talked about and move into philanthropy. Again, all these four things are interrelated. Philanthropy in this sense, the sponsorship of the Jaipur Literary Festival is itself a form of philanthropy, but Roy sets her sights a little wider now. She zooms out a bit and she gives us this line that I love, that I absolutely love and think about quite a bit as well. This is page 21. I can't see the page number sometimes because my copy is so marked up and there's so many different... Anyway, I have to peel these back to see the page numbers sometimes. But anyway, she's talking about sort of the origins of corporate philanthropy. And this is what she's really taking aim at here, because she's saying, or she's just said, Tata Steel has used the Jaipur Literary Festival to launder its reputation, to present itself as something that it definitely is not, to flip the narrative and make those people the terrorists, while we, who are doing the displacing, cannot possibly be terrorists because we support the arts. And she takes a look at corporate philanthropy and she gives us this line, and I want to give this whole quote, again, page 21. She says, "Their enthralling history, which is faded from contemporary memory, began in the United States in the early 20th century, when, kitted out legally in the form of endowed foundations, corporate philanthropy began to replace missionary activity as capitalism's and imperialism's road opening and systems maintenance patrol." I love that line. I absolutely love it. It is so evocative and so powerful. Just imagining where once missionaries used to go in and open up markets, now it's the people on the corporate philanthropy team who do the exact same thing. That is their function. And she talks about a couple things. She talks about the Carnegie Foundation, she talks about the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Ford Foundation as well. And she takes specific aim at these, but she does mention a bunch of other ones throughout this chapter. And she talks about these early days of American sort of runaway capitalism. She calls these the Carnegies and the Rockefellers of this period of the US, the Bonnies of their time. And that's absolutely right. And with all of this surplus money, they start creating these charitable foundations to, of course, launder their reputation. That's very important, but also to, again, open up markets, and they do that quite effectively. And she also mentions very briefly that, people back then said, well, if you have so much extra money, why don't you just raise the wages of your workers? Which is, of course, a ridiculous thing to say. Why on earth would anybody ever do that? Let's not be crazy. And she talks about the way that these corporate-owned and endowed foundations set their experts to a very specific end, and that is to enforce the rules of the game, to enforce what we call the Washington Consensus. These rules, so privatize your public industries, sell off your national patrimony, make things easier for investors who want to enter the country, suspend your trade rules, free float your currency, things like that. All of these things that continually come in. These experts are preaching this. Again, very much like the missionaries that she mentions in the first instance. These are, instead of missionaries going in and selling people on the virtues of the country that they come from, the empire that they come from, and the religion that they profess, now these are corporate missionaries going in and preaching the virtues of unfettered capitalism. And there are a few things that if you don't already recognize the Rockefeller Foundation or the Ford Foundation. The Ford Foundation, by the way, is supposed to be the more liberal of the two. It never has been, but the Ford Foundation is the one that sets up the Council for Foreign Relations and later the Rand Corporation. And chances are you've seen, if not literally the Council of Foreign Relations or the Rand Corporation, you've seen some of their research and insights because it is disseminated extremely widely in the media. Sorry, minor equipment malfunction. Back to corporate philanthropy. What Roy is saying here is that a lot of these corporate philanthropy actions have been linked to things like extending credit to people who can't necessarily afford that credit. And we can also think of the major microfinance institutions like Grameen Bank that have pushed people into taking on small loans that has inspired a wave of farmer suicides, for example, in Bangladesh. Things like that, forcing people into credit because credit is supposed to be good. Credit is supposed to open up opportunities. But also things like pushing neoliberal ideas in places like Chile, with the Chicago boys, forcing through structural adjustment programs, through places like the IMF and the World Bank as well. A lot of these Roy links directly with this corporate philanthropy push, which is a really, really interesting take on this. And one that I think there are a lot of factors at play here, but it's undeniable. It's very, very tough to disagree with this point. Now, I am skimming through these examples a little bit just in the interest of time, but if you would like to know more about any of these, particularly microfinance and the expansion of credit and credit cards, which I think is an extremely damaging thing, of course, I'd love to talk in more length about this. So please do let me know in any of the comments if you want a little bit more detail on this sort of thing and this thing. But let's go on to one of the most dire quotes that Roy gives us in this whole thing, which is just to say that the industry of human rights is pushed in a direction because of these corporations. And a lot of people who care get pushed in a particular direction. And this is the quote on page 34. She says, "Armed with their billions, these NGOs have waded into the world, turning potential revolutionaries into salaried activists, funding artists, intellectuals, and filmmakers, gently luring them away from radical confrontation, ushering them in the direction of multiculturalism, gender equity, community development, the discourse couched in the language of identity politics and human rights." That's a tough quote to sit with, and it requires a little bit of background here. So Roya is not saying that these things aren't valuable. She is a hardcore feminist. She really believes in this stuff. But one of the things that she thinks, and she says this, I believe at a couple points in the book, is that the movements that she's describing, especially the Maoists, really lost their battle a little bit by excluding women. And because it is such a patriarchal movement, it allowed the less radical elements to come in and co-opt their revolution, saying, shouldn't we care about women? Shouldn't we care about this? Shouldn't we care about that? And so the true revolutionary struggle was thus co-opted into a more sanitized version. And when Roy says identity politics pejoratively, it is because extremely powerful people will use identity politics to divide the solidarity on the left. So she is critical, of course, of these Maoist movements, but she is also critical of the left for allowing itself to be co-opted in this way. And that's an extremely powerful insight. And it's also something that I 100% agree with. I think that often we lose ourselves in these small debates about identity politics when in fact it is, of course, perfectly possible to be a queer, evil billionaire. We're kind of all in this struggle together. But Roy's point is more subtle than that as well. She's also saying, listen, human rights, the way we understand it, has become a bit of an industry. It's become corporatized in a very pernicious way. People who are radicalized, who care about the world, can often easily be shunted into this system of corporate philanthropy and convinced that they are doing something when in fact they're doing completely the opposite. When in fact a lot of these corporate philanthropic pushes are going completely the opposite way and are more about opening markets than actually helping people. Now, that's not to say they don't do valuable work. That's, of course, they do valuable work. And of course, it's wonderful to, build wells in a place where no wells existed before so that people have access to drinking water. That's undeniably important. But it becomes a problem when you do that instead of actually having a corporation take ownership for the things that it has done in this region, or actually fomenting a revolution that could allow that community to build their own damn wells. And so when I read this line, I get a little bit sad because I know very well-meaning people who work in these positions, often in corporate philanthropy, because we all need to survive, and this one pays the bills and lets them have a family and a reasonably happy life. But are they doing what they set out to do? And Lord knows, am I doing what I set out to do? Probably not. One other thing I just wanted to mention briefly, and this is literally because I am from the United States and I've seen this a lot, is when she talks on page 38 and 39 about the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. And she uses this as an example for sanitizing a revolutionary. So this Martin Luther King Jr. was a major problem, right? He as she says, he linked capitalism, imperialism, racism, and the Vietnam War, which for people in power at the time was extremely difficult. And so there was a major push to sort of sanitize Martin Luther King Jr.'s image after this time. And she says, page 38 going to 39, she says, foundations and corporations worked hard to remodel his legacy to fit a market-friendly format. The Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change, with an operational grant of $2 million, was set up by, among others, the Ford Motor Company, General Motors, Mobil, Western Electric, Procter & Gamble, U.S. Steel, and Monsanto. The center maintains the King Library and the archives of the Civil Rights Movement. Among the many programs the King Center runs have been projects that work closely with the United States Department of Defense, the Armed Forces Chaplains Board, and others. It co-sponsors the Martin Luther King Jr. Lecture Series called the Free Enterprise System, an agent for nonviolent social change. Amen. Which is tough to read, and I don't really have anything more to say about that. Now that's human rights, and as you can see, as I said from the beginning, these notions of terrorism, who we consider to be a terrorist and who isn't, as well as who decides what art gets made and who sponsors art, and also what about these philanthropic pushes behind a lot of the world's evils, and then how do we understand our notion of human rights? All of these things are things that Roy is really flipping on their heads. And as I said, these are all very tightly interrelated. And as much as I love a structure to these lectures, I almost didn't want to separate this lecture into these things because they are so tightly wound together, but I still think it's helpful just to think of them in discrete packages, just to help a little bit. But as I promised as well, right at the end of this chapter, Roy, in a brilliant rhetorical flourish, goes back to Antilla. Remember, this is the compound mansion that the Ambani family builds. So Antilla, Roy tells us, is the name of a set of kind of mythical islands off the Iberian Peninsula, and this is where, after the Muslim conquest of the Iberian Peninsula, or most of it, several bishops fled. And as they fled, they go to these islands, and behind them, they burn their boats. They sever this connection to these barbarians that surround them. And on these islands, they continue to exist. And this, for Roy, is kind of a perfect metaphor for how the Ambanis see themselves. They are building Antilla to sever the connection to the barbarian hordes that are beyond the walls of their gated compound. And she has this paragraph, and I'll end on this. She says, "As night fell over Mumbai, guards in crisp linen shirts with crackling walkie-talkies appeared outside the forbidding gates of Antilla. The lights blazed on to scare away the ghosts, perhaps. The neighbors complain that Antilla's bright lights have stolen the night. Perhaps it's time for us to take back the night." And that is the first chapter of Arundhati Roy's Capitalism, a Ghost Story. As I say, this book is brilliant. I hope you enjoy this. Let me know, what do you think I may have glossed over in this chapter that we need to talk about more? There's so much to it, so I would love to dip back into this chapter for sure. If you guys are interested in any of this, let me know. And as always, just let me know what you think about this stuff. Are you reading this for the first time? Are you revisiting this? Have you read? I understand that in the UK, at least, often people are assigned in secondary school, they're assigned The God of Small Things to read. I was never assigned that in the US. It's something I read as a kid and absolutely loved, and it's something that I returned to a couple of years ago. But if you've read The God of Small Things, what do you think about Arundhati Roy's political work? Let me know on the Patreon, on any of the social channels, whatever you like. And thank you for reading. We'll see you next week for Chapter 2. Thank you.